After the humiliating retreat across Cyrenaica in January and February 1942, the Rommel myth, so fervently propagated by Goebbels, was also promoted by the British. The legend of the Desert Fox was a very misguided attempt to explain away their own failures. Hitler was amazed and delighted by such hero worship. It encouraged his belief that the British, after all their defeats in the Far East, were close to collapse. He was, however, prepared to rein in his favorite general to appease the Italians. Mussolini's position was threatened by growing opposition within the Comando Supremo, whose members felt that the Duce was too much in Hitler's pocket. And they had been affronted by Rommel's arrogance and peremptory demands, to say nothing of his constant complaints about their failure to provide and protect the supply convoys he needed. In addition, Halder and the OKH were still resolutely opposed to reinforcing Rommel. They argued that the Suez Canal should be taken only after an advance through the Caucasus. The priority of the Eastern Front remained a powerful argument as they prepared their great offensive in southern Russia. Only the Kriegsmarine, which wanted a policy of defeating Britain first, supported Rommel's ambitions. The island of Malta was in a desperate position after a renewed Luftwaffe bombing offensive against the airfields and the main harbor of Valletta. All 5 ships in a convoy in March were sunk and the troops and civilian population faced starvation. But in May, a reinforcement of 60 Spitfires flown off the aircraft carrier USS Wasp and the arrival of a mine layer with supplies saved the island. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, the German commander-in-chief in the Mediterranean, had made plans for an airborne invasion of Malta, Operation Hercules, but these had to be put aside. Not only was Hitler dubious of success, but Ex-Fliegerkorps was needed further east. Also, the Italians demanded excessive support before committing themselves. Rommel once again ignored both his orders and his supply problems and began to move the Panzer Army Africa forward towards the Gazala line. The fighting has none of the horror, that indescribable misery of a Russian campaign, an Unteroffizier wrote home in April. No villages and towns destroyed or laid waste. In another letter that evening, he wrote to his mother, "The Tommy out here takes everything in a more sporting way. Onwards to a decisive victory." Although Rommel's soldiers were also afflicted by the mass of flies and the intense heat which baked their bread hard, they soon expected a victory from the great offensive in Russia. Then the Tommies here will be crushed from both sides. They looked forward to visiting Cairo. The OKW then suddenly came round to the idea of Rommel's dream of seizing Egypt and the Suez Canal. Hitler had begun to fear that American military support might arrive earlier than he had originally thought. Even an Allied attack across the Channel could not be ruled out. If Rommel could smash the Eighth Army, he reasoned, British morale would be shattered. Also, the Japanese had indicated that they would advance westwards into the Indian Ocean only if the Germans took the Suez Canal. The first stage of Rommel's invasion of Egypt, codenamed Operation Theseus, was to outflank the British defensive line. This extended in defended boxes from Gazala on the coast, some 80 kilometers west of Tobruk, southwards to Bur Hakim, an outpost in the desert defended by General Marie-Pierre Koenig's 1st Free French Brigade. There were 7 boxes, each defended by an infantry brigade group, with artillery, barbed wire, and minefields, which extended down to the next box. To the rear, Ritchie had placed his armored formations ready to make a counterattack. Rommel then intended to seize Tobruk. The capture of this port was regarded as essential for resupply, otherwise it would take his Opel Blitz trucks 14 days for each round trip up from Tripoli and back again. Operation Theseus should not have taken the British unawares, since Bletchley had passed the relevant ultra-decrypts to GHQ Middle East. But the chain of command was reluctant to pass the information down, except to say that an attack was probable in May and that it might well take the form of a right hook from the south. The attack began on May 26th, with Italian infantry divisions advancing against the northern half of the line in a feint. To the south, the Trieste Motorized Division and RE Armor Division, together with the 3 German panzer divisions, moved deep into the desert. A sandstorm concealed their 10,000 vehicles from the eyes of the British. Then, during the night, Rommel's main striking force outflanked the Gazala line from the south. Rommel led his divisions rapidly round in a wide sweep, making use of the bright moon once the Khamsin dropped. They were in position before dawn, ready to attack. Some 30 kilometers northeast of Bur Hakim, the 15th Panzer Division clashed with the 4th Armored Brigade, inflicting heavy losses on the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment and the 8th Hussars. Soon afterwards, 80 British tanks counterattacked the 21st Panzer Division. The 8th Army now had 167 American Grant tanks. These were heavy, unusually tall, and not very maneuverable when it came to firing, but their 75mm guns were far more effective than the pathetic 2-pounders on the Crusaders. The 3rd Indian Motorized Brigade, to the southeast of Burr-Hakim, had meanwhile been hit at 6.30 hours on May 27th. Their commander radioed back that they were facing a whole bloody German armor division, when in fact it was the Italian RE division. The Indian troops destroyed 52 tanks, but they were overwhelmed once all their anti-tank guns had been knocked out. Koenig's Free French Brigade, in their equally lonely position at Burr-Hakim, knew what awaited them, having heard the sound of tank engines out in the desert during the night. In the morning, a patrol confirmed that the enemy was behind them and had cut them off from their supply depot. Koenig's force of some 4,000 men included a half-brigade of the Foreign Legion, 2 battalions of colonial troops, and marine infantry. They also had their own artillery support with 54 French 75mm field guns and Bofors guns. Like the other boxes, their first line of defense consisted of minefields and barbed wire. The tanks of the RE division now turned against them and attacked in a mass. French gunners knocked out 32. Only 6 Italian tanks managed to break through the mines and wire, but French legionnaires destroyed them at close range. Some even climbed onto the Italian tanks and fired through slits and hatches. The attack was unsupported by infantry, and the French bravely fought off every wave, inflicting heavy losses and taking 91 prisoners, including a regimental commander. Skirmishes were also fought against the German 90th Light Division. For the first time since June 1940, General de Gaulle later wrote proudly, French and Germans were in action against each other. To the northeast, the rest of a 90th Light Division attacked the 7th Motorized Brigade and forced the outnumbered British to withdraw. Its units then overran the 7th Armored Division headquarters and took various supply dumps. Although the 90th Light advanced rapidly, Rommel's 2 panzer divisions were hampered by counterattacks and heavy artillery fire on their advance north towards the airfield at El Adem, which had been the scene of such heavy fighting the year before. Rommel's daring plan had not succeeded as he had hoped. His forces were in a vulnerable position between the Gazala Line boxes and the remainder of the British armor to the west. Rommel had also expected the French at Burr-Hakim to be rapidly crushed, but they still held out. He was deeply worried, and many of his officers thought that the offensive had failed. His chief of staff even suggested telling the OKW that the operation had merely been a reconnaissance in strength in an attempt to protect the Panzer Army Africa's reputation. But they need not have worried. Once again, the British had failed to concentrate their tanks sufficiently to make an impact. Rommel wanted to forge on north to the coastal road and break the British line there so as to re-establish his supply line back to Tripoli. But from May 28th, fighting became chaotic inside the center of the Gazala Line. Rommel's divisions were hampered by fuel and ammunition shortages, but again, he was saved by the slowness of British commanders to exploit their considerable advantage. Ritchie wanted to send in a major night attack, but his corps and divisional commanders argued that they needed more time. They thought that the Germans were trapped, but Axis troops had been making a gap in the minefield to the west, and supplies began to come through. However, this passage was close to the 150th Brigade's box, whose Yorkshire battalions suddenly provided Rommel with a major problem. At the Wolfschanz in East Prussia, Hitler's attention was not on North Africa. His Luftwaffe adjutant, Nicholas von Below, returned from a visit to Rommel to find a very unpleasant situation. On May 27th, Reinhard Heydrich had been attacked in Prague by young Czechs equipped by the British Special Operations Executive. Heydrich was still just alive, but would succumb to infections from his wounds within a week. And on the night of May 30th, the RAF had launched its first 1,000-bomber raid against Cologne. Hitler was beside himself with rage, mainly directed against Göring. From May 31st, during the scrappy battle which the British called the Cauldron and the Germans the Sausage Pot, Rommel then threw his forces against 150th Brigade's position. The onslaught with tanks, artillery, and Stukas was massive. The brigade fought to the end with great courage, winning the admiration of the Germans. But the continuing failure of British commanders to counterattack in force from the west was one of the least impressive examples of generalship in the war. Rommel then ordered the 90th Light Division and the Trieste Division to destroy the French at Burr-Hakim so that he could start to break up the Gazala line from the south. On June 3rd, Koenig's men fought off the overwhelming force attacking them. The British sent a relief force, but it ran into the 21st Panzer Division and pulled back. No other attempt was made to relieve the French garrison, partly because the counterattack further north on June 5 collapsed due to the incompetence and timidity of formation commanders reluctant to risk their tanks against the Germans' 88mm guns. Some supplies got through. The RAF provided as much support as possible, helping to break up attacks and fight off the Stukas and Heinkels. French colonial troops made short work of any Stuka pilots who parachuted down. Koenig's men, suffering in intense heat and dust from thirst and hunger, dug their foxholes deeper, waiting for a greater onslaught. By holding on, they knew that they could greatly aid the withdrawal of the Eighth Army. Exasperated by the tenacity of the French defense, Rommel took command himself. On June 8th, German artillery and Stukas began to pound the position again. One bomb killed 17 wounded in the dressing station. The determination of the defenders never slackened. One officer saw the sole survivor of a gun crew, a legionnaire with a hand blown off, reload the 75mm by ramming home the shell with his bloody stump. On June 10th, the French defenses were breached. The defenders of Burr-Hakim had no more ammunition. That night, the British 7th Armored Division, the only formation which might have saved them, withdrew. Koenig was ordered to pull back. He led most of his remaining men out through the German encirclement in the dark, at first undetected, and then under heavy fire. He was accompanied by his courageous English driver and mistress Susan Travers, who was later made a warrant officer in the French Foreign Legion. Rommel received an order from Hitler to execute any captured legionnaires, whether Frenchmen who should be treated as insurgents or anti-fascist Germans, or citizens of other Nazi-occupied countries. To his credit, he ensured that they were treated as ordinary prisoners of war. When General de Gaulle heard from General Sir Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, that Koenig and most of his men had escaped back to British lines, his sentiments were so intense that he had to shut himself alone in a room. "Oh, the heart beating with emotion, sobs of pride, tears of joy," he wrote later in his memoirs. This moment, he knew, marked the start of the resurrection of France. Further north, the Battle of the Cauldron continued, with the British and Indian brigades fighting stubbornly in defense, but the Eighth Army still remained incapable of launching an effective counterattack. On June 11th, just after the fall of Burr-Hakim, Rommel ordered his 3 German divisions to destroy the remaining British positions, including the Knightsbridge box held by the 201st Guards Brigade and 4th Armored Brigade. They were then to seize the Via Balbia. This prompted a sudden withdrawal on June 14th, when the South Africans and the 50th Division near the coast were ordered to pull back to the Egyptian frontier to avoid being cut off. An undignified general retreat ensued, which became known as the Gazala Gallop. Tobruk was left exposed, and the Italian infantry advanced to encircle it from the east. Rommel brought up his German divisions, although 21st Panzer was severely mauled in the process by RAF Hurricane and P-40 Kitty Hawk fighter bombers. Air Vice Marshal Arthur Coningham's Desert Air Force was improving its techniques all the time, and without its support the fate of the Eighth Army might have been catastrophic. Churchill sent orders to Auchinleck that Tobruk had to be held at all costs. But Tobruk lacked sufficient troops and guns, and many of the mines from its defenses had been taken to strengthen the Gazala line. On June 17th, Rommel began his assault with a feint against one corner of the perimeter, while secretly preparing to attack elsewhere. Unlike the Australians who had defended Tobruk so doggedly the year before, the 2nd South African Division, commanded by Major General Hendrik Klopper, was inexperienced. In any case, Admiral Cunningham was well aware that he did not have the ships to supply Tobruk through another siege. The 33,000-strong garrison included another 2 infantry brigades and a weak armored brigade with obsolete tanks. At dawn on June 20th, Kesselring sent in all the Stuka and bomber groups available in the Mediterranean, supported by squadrons of the Italian Air Force, the Regia Aeronautica. This was accompanied by a concentrated artillery bombardment, while German pioneer battalions cleared a route through the minefields. The 11th Indian Brigade was shocked by the unprecedented onslaught, and by 8:30 hours the 1st Panzers were through the outer defenses. In the course of a single day, as columns of smoke rose into the sky from the battered town, the Germans advanced all the way to the port, cutting the 20-kilometer-long fortress position in two. It was a bewilderingly swift victory. General Klopper surrendered the following morning, before the port and many of the supply dumps had been destroyed. 4,000 tons of oil fell into Rommel's hands, the best gift he could have hoped for. His hungry soldiers, whose clothes were almost in rags, became ecstatic at the booty. "We've got chocolate, tinned milk, canned vegetables, and biscuits by the crate," an unteroffizier wrote home. "We've got English vehicles and weapons in vast quantities." What a feeling to put on English shirts and stockings. Italian soldiers did not get to share in the rich pickings. The same unteroffizier acknowledged that they have it harder than us, with less water, less food, less pay, and not the same equipment as we have. Mussolini tried to pretend that the capture of Tobruk was an Italian victory, so to emphasize the truth, Hitler immediately promoted the 14-year-old Rommel to the rank of General Feldmarschall. This promotion produced a good deal of jealousy and resentment in the highest levels of the Wehrmacht, which Hitler no doubt enjoyed. On this, the first anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, the German dictator was overjoyed in his certainty that the British Empire had now begun to disintegrate as he had claimed. And in a week's time, Operation Blue was to be launched in southern Russia to seize the Caucasus. The Third Reich once more appeared invincible. On that June day, Churchill was in the White House with Roosevelt when an aide came in and passed a slip of paper to the president. He read it and then passed it to the prime minister. Churchill felt sick with disbelief. He asked General Ismay to check with London whether Tobruk really had fallen. Ismay returned to confirm that it was true. The humiliation at such a moment could not have been greater. Churchill later wrote, "Defeat is one thing, disgrace is another." Roosevelt, showing his most generous instincts, immediately asked what he could do to help. Churchill requested as many of the new Sherman tanks as the Americans could spare. 4 days later, the American chiefs of staff agreed to the dispatch of 300 Shermans, as well as 100 105mm self-propelled guns. It was an act of great selflessness, especially since the Shermans had to be snatched back from U.S. Army formations, which had been longing to replace their obsolete vehicles. Deeply depressed and shocked, Churchill returned to face a motion of no confidence in the House of Commons. He put most of the blame on Auchinleck, which was hardly fair. The Auc's main mistake was to have appointed Ritchie. The acute shortage of competent and decisive commanders at the most senior levels in the British Army clearly had a terrible influence on its performance. Brooke ascribed this to the deaths of the best young officers in the First World War. An equally crippling handicap was the long-standing disaster of the arms procurement system. Unlike the RAF, which had attracted the most talented designers and engineers in an age when aviation was exciting, the Army accepted armaments which were already obsolete and then continued to mass-produce them, rather than go back to the drawing board. This cycle had begun with the loss of so much equipment at Dunkirk and the need to replace weapons rapidly, but had not been broken. Some of the new 6-pounder anti-tank guns had been used with good effect in the Gazala battles, but to send badly designed tanks with 2-pounder guns into action against the Panzer IV, and especially the 88mm gun, was like sending up Gloucester Gladiator biplanes against Messerschmitt 109s. One can only admire the bravery of crews going into the attack, well aware that their own tanks were virtually useless, except against infantry. The British did not produce a truly battle-worthy tank, the Comet, until the very last days of the war. Churchill's only consolation from his visit to the United States was that he had managed to persuade Roosevelt to agree to the invasion of French North Africa. Operation Gymnast, which later became Operation Torch, had been fiercely opposed by General Marshall and the other American chiefs of staff. Marshall's fears of Churchill getting at Roosevelt when none of the president's military advisors were present had been vindicated. They suspected, with a degree of justification, that Britain wanted to preserve its position in the Middle East. But Churchill was afraid that if Britain lost Egypt and the Germans managed to link up an invasion through the Caucasus with Rommel's advance, then not just the Suez Canal, but the oil fields of the region could be lost. It might also encourage the Japanese to extend their operations into the western Indian Ocean. Churchill had another reason which chimed well with Roosevelt's thinking. Since an early invasion of northern France was out of the question because of a lack of air superiority and a shortage of shipping and landing craft, there was no other area in which American troops could be deployed against Germany. And the Prime Minister knew that Admiral King, as well as the American public, wanted to drop the Germany first strategy and concentrate on the Pacific. Even Brooke was highly dubious about the North Africa landings, but Churchill was proved right, albeit for very different reasons to the ones he had put forward. The U.S. Army needed battle experience before it could take on the Wehrmacht in major battles on the mainland of Europe. And the Allies needed to learn the dangers of amphibious operations before they attempted a cross-channel invasion. Kesselring still wanted to conquer Malta first, but Rommel was adamant. He had to have the Luftwaffe supporting him so that he could destroy the Eighth Army before it had a chance to recover. Hitler supported Rommel with the argument that the capture of Egypt would make Malta irrelevant. But they both overlooked the fact that while the Luftwaffe was being diverted to support Rommel during the Gazella battles, Malta had been reinforced. Yet again, supply lines across the Mediterranean were at risk, and the seizure of Tobruk with its port had not solved the logistic conundrum of the Desert War as Rommel had hoped. In what was referred to as the rubber band effect of these campaigns, the overextended supply line led to disaster, hauling back the attacker. Even before the fall of Tobruk, Rommel had ordered the 90th Light Division to push on towards Egypt along the coast road. And on June 23rd, the two panzer divisions were also sent in pursuit of the 8th Army. Heinleck meanwhile sacked Ritchie and took command himself. He wisely canceled orders to make a stand at Mersa Matruh and instructed all formations to withdraw rapidly to El Alamein, a small railway halt near the sea. Between Alamein and the Qattara Depression to the south, with its salt marshes and quicksands, he intended to establish his defensive line, secure in the knowledge that Rommel would not be able to outflank it as easily as he had at Gazala. Morale in the 8th Army could not have been worse. Despite Heinleck's determination to pull back to El Alamein, Ritchie's earlier order had left the 10th Indian Division defending Mersa Matruh. It was caught by the speed of Rommel's advance units, which encircled the town, cutting the coast road. Part of X Corps managed to break out, but lost over 7,000 men taken prisoner in the process. Further south, the New Zealand Division broke through the 21st Panzer Division in a vicious night attack, killing wounded, medics and combatants alike, an action which the Germans considered a war crime. Rommel was still convinced that he had the 8th Army on the run and could strike through to the Middle East. Mussolini was so certain of success that he arrived in the port city of Derna, followed by a magnificent gray stallion, on which he would take the victory parade in the Egyptian capital. In Cairo itself, panic and confusion reigned in all the offices of GHQ Middle East and the British Embassy, to the amusement or alarm of most Egyptians. Long queues formed outside banks. On July 1st, columns of smoke rose into the air from documents burned in the gardens of official buildings. They created a snowstorm of partly charged secret papers around the city. Street vendors snatched them up to make cones for their peanuts, and the day became known as Ash Wednesday. Members of the European community began to leave by car, with mattresses strapped to the roof in scenes reminiscent of Paris 2 years before. The flap, as it was called, had started in Alexandria when Vice Admiral Sir Henry Harwood, who had just taken over from Cunningham, ordered the dispersal of the British fleet to other ports in the Levant. Rumors spread that the Germans would arrive in 24 hours and that an airborne invasion was expected at any moment. Egyptian shopkeepers prepared portraits of Hitler and Mussolini ready to hang in their establishments. Others went much further. Nationalist officers, hoping that the Germans would give them independence from the British, began to prepare for an uprising. One officer named Anwar Sadat, later president of the country, bought up 10,000 empty bottles for making Molotov cocktails. For the Jewish community, the prospect was terrifying, but although the British authorities in Cairo offered them priority on the trains to Palestine, the Palestine administration refused them visas. Jewish fears were not misplaced. An SS Einsatzkommando unit was waiting in Athens to begin work in Egypt, and then in Palestine if Rommel's string of victories continued. Desertions in the British Army of the Nile, as Churchill called it, rose dramatically, bringing the estimated total in the city and the delta to 25,000 men. British officers felt a characteristic urge to make jokes in the face of disaster. Having always complained about the slowness of the service in Shepheard's Hotel, they said, "Just wait till Rommel gets to Shepheard's. That'll slow him up." A rumor went round that Rommel had already telephoned to book a room. Certainly German radio had broadcast a message to the women of Alexandria, "Get out your party frocks, we're on the way." But Axis triumphalism was premature. Although the Germans had been intercepting British signals traffic on a tactical level, Heinleck was well aware of Rommel's plans through Ultra. In the early hours of July 1st, the Afrika Korps with the two panzer divisions set off to make a feint attack towards the south of the Alamein line. Rommel's real target lay further north, but in his impatience to catch the 8th Army off balance, he had dispensed with reconnaissance. This proved a bad mistake, made worse by a sandstorm. The 90th Light Division tried to attack the Alamein box, but was repulsed by unexpectedly heavy artillery fire. Soon afterwards, the 21st Panzer Division advanced on one of the central boxes held by the 18th Indian Brigade. Although it took the position, it lost a third of its tanks, many of them to RAF fighter bombers. Cunningham's Desert Air Force continued its relentless attacks. His pilots were maintaining an even greater rhythm of sorties than during the Battle of Britain. With pilots from many nations, the Air Force included the Free French Group de Chasse Alsace, armed with a mixed complement of aircraft. Cunningham badly needed Spitfires to take on the Messerschmitts, but the Air Ministry in London was reluctant to release them from home defense. His Desert Air Force was now helped by an American bombing group of B-24 Liberators attacking Axis ships and the ports of Benghazi, Tobruk, and Mersa Matruh. The U.S. Middle East Army Air Force was assembling under the command of Major General Lewis H. Brereton, with both fighter and bombardment groups. British and American forces were for the first time in action alongside each other. German expectations of an easy victory began to falter. Einlech counterattacked with mobile groups and concentrated his artillery to great effect. And the New Zealand Division again excelled itself by seizing the perfect moment for a sudden counterattack on the RE Division, sending it back in disorder. On the night of July 3rd, Rommel ordered the Panzerarmee Afrika onto the defensive. It had less than 50 tanks in a battle-worthy state. His men were totally exhausted and short of ammunition and fuel. He simply could not afford a battle of unremittent hard pounding. The rock, scree, and sand of the Alamein line did not offer a hospitable environment for the men of the Eighth Army either. They were tormented by ubiquitous swarms of aggressive flies and by sandstorms whipped up by the winds, as well as by the enervating heat of the desert. Tanks were literally like ovens under the blazing sun. At night, soldiers wrapped themselves tightly in a ground sheet to keep out scorpions. They suffered from dysentery spread by the flies, as well as from desert sores which also attracted these voracious insects. And whenever they tried to eat their corned beef hash or hardtack biscuits ground up to make a porridge with the consistency of plaster of Paris, it was hard not to swallow a few flies in the process. A brew-up of tea was the only consolation, even if the water used to make it tasted pretty foul. Not surprisingly, the soldiers' thoughts tended to focus on home cooking and home comforts. A rifleman declared to his comrades that when he made a home, he was going to spend his time eating chocolate ice creams while sitting on the toilet and enjoying the luxury of pulling the chain. The Eighth Army was also too exhausted to seize the opportunity to counterattack. Instead, it concentrated on strengthening its position along the line, with a fresh Australian brigade brought up to the Ruisat Ridge. Rommel attacked again on July 10th. But in the north, the 9th Australian Division, supported by an armored brigade, broke through the Italians near El Alamein and put them to flight. Their most important prize was to capture Rommel's own signals intelligence unit, a coup which made him effectively blind now that the Germans were no longer able to break the American code. The American military attaché Bonner Fellers, who had unwittingly provided the Germans with their most reliable intelligence source, had left at the end of June. Throughout most of July, the two sides attacked and counterattacked in a military version of scissors, paper, stone. Rommel was incensed by the performance of most Italian formations, which produced bitter arguments between the Axis allies. He felt forced to split up some of his formations to insert corset stiffeners among some of the Italian divisions. And his outraged protests about the lack of resupply again proved futile, for the RAF and the Royal Navy were once more inflicting heavy losses on Axis convoys and port installations. His dream that the capture of Tobruk and Mersa Matruh would solve his problems at a stroke were rudely shattered. On the night of July 26th, the recently formed Special Air Service in jeeps attacked an airfield near Fuka and destroyed 37 aircraft on the ground, many of them Junkers 52 transports. It brought their total for the month to 86 aircraft destroyed. Einlech's achievement should not be underestimated. He had at the very least saved a heavily battered Eighth Army from disaster and stabilized the line, while inflicting heavy losses on the Germans. Churchill viewed things in a very different light. He saw only missed opportunities and refused to acknowledge the exhaustion of the troops and the scandalous inferiority of British armored vehicles. The Prime Minister, accompanied by General Sir Alan Brooke, arrived in Cairo on August 3rd on his way to Moscow to warn Stalin about the postponement of the Second Front. The British thought that they had finally stonewalled the Americans into abandoning Operation Sledgehammer, the cross-channel attack to invade the Cotentin Peninsula so rashly promised to Molotov. But in the second week of July, there were signs of rebellion among the American Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson. In the belief that the British were secretly against any invasion of northern France, they argued for an abandonment of the Germany First policy and a switch of focus to the Pacific. Roosevelt, invoking his role as commander-in-chief, stopped them in their tracks on July 14th. Sending troops to capture odd islands in the Pacific was just what Germany hoped they would do, he wrote to Marshall, and would not affect the world situation this year or next. And it certainly would not help Russia or the Middle East. Whether or not this was largely a bluff on Marshall's part aimed at forcing the British to commit themselves to a cross-channel invasion is still unclear. But Marshall and Admiral King returned to the charge later in the month when they visited Churchill at Chequers and tried to revive Sledgehammer. The British remained resolutely opposed. It would be a disaster and could do nothing to help the Red Army. Harry Hopkins, who was also in London, privately encouraged the British in the knowledge that Roosevelt wanted to see American troops in action in North Africa. Marshall, finally obliged to make the best of what he considered a bad job of fighting Britain's war, sent one of his best staff officers, Major General Dwight D. Eisenhower, to begin planning the North African landings in London, with a view to taking overall command. Before continuing his journey on to the Soviet Union, Churchill was determined to sort out the command structure in the Middle East. Auchinleck told him that it would not be wise to launch another attack before mid-September, so Churchill decided to replace him with General Sir Harold Alexander as commander-in-chief. He also chose Lieutenant General Strafer, Gott, the commander of 13 Corps, to take over the 8th Army. Gott, although he had been one of the better desert commanders, was tired out and demoralized by this stage. Brooke wanted Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery instead, but Churchill was adamant. The situation was resolved when Gott was killed after his plane was shot down by Messerschmitt. Montgomery would take command after all. Montgomery took a pride in being different from the usual senior officer of the British Army. And the short, wiry little general with a beaky nose could hardly have been more of a contrast to the unassuming, aristocratic, and immaculate Alexander. Monty dressed differently too, preferring a shapeless pullover and corduroys, topped later by a black Royal Tank Regiment beret, as his hallmark. Yet he was a military conservative, believing in detailed staff work and the deployment of divisions, not the informal battle groups which had evolved in the Desert Campaign. He played shamelessly to the crowd, whether soldiers or journalists, despite his rather shrill voice and inability to pronounce his Rs. A non-smoker and teetotaler, he was egotistic, ambitious and ruthless, possessing a boundless self-confidence which occasionally bordered on the fatuous. But this self-belief, which he was able to convey to all he met, lay at the heart of his mission to turn the badly bruised 8th Army into one confident of victory. Commanders had to get a grip, and there was to be no more bellyaching or querying of orders. The situation that Montgomery inherited in August 1942 was by no means as dire as his own myth-making later pretended. Rommel's German and Italian divisions had suffered a considerable battering during the July battles. But Montgomery was rightly appalled by the defeatist attitude of many senior officers on the staff, although he was wrong to imply that Auchinleck shared their views. Auchinleck's failing had been his ignorance of this mood among the Gabardine swine, as fighting officers called the inhabitants of Headquarters Middle East in Cairo. Montgomery announced to the 8th Army that he had ordered the burning of all contingency plans for withdrawal. And with considerable theatrical effect, he managed to rebuild its morale and confidence through visits and training programs. An impression of dramatic change worked wonders, even if Montgomery was claiming for himself a number of innovations which had begun under Auchinleck. Montgomery had no intention of launching a premature offensive, even though such caution had been the main reason behind Auchinleck's dismissal. But he was much cleverer in the way he handled the Prime Minister. In fact, Montgomery planned to take longer than Auchinleck's date of mid-September. He was determined to build up his army to such an overwhelming strength that victory could be virtually guaranteed. In this, he was almost certainly correct, because Britain could not have faced another fiasco. Rommel had been reinforced with the 164th Division and a brigade of paratroopers, but he knew his position was now worse than precarious. His forces were too weak to continue a battle of attrition against the Alamein line. Instead, he wanted to withdraw so as to bring the British out of their positions and to impose on them a battle movement in which his panzer troops would have the advantage. He was still short of transport and fuel as the RAF and Royal Navy sank one supply ship after another. Suffering from stress and furious frustration, he criticized in bitter and sweeping terms the performance of Italian troops, even though some formations, especially the Folgore Division, were fighting well. In the second half of August, roles were reversed, with Mussolini and Kesselring urging Rommel to launch an offensive as soon as possible, while he had become reluctant and pessimistic. On August 30th, Sensing that he was damned if he did and damned if he didn't, Rommel launched his right hook against the southern part of the 8th Army line to swing round behind and attack the Alam Halfa Ridge. He knew that the greatest risk lay in running out of fuel, but Kesselring had promised that tankers were due to dock and that the supplies would be rushed forward. Montgomery, aware of Rommel's plan through ultra-decrypts, placed his armored formations ready to parry the thrust, more or less as Auchinleck had planned. Rommel's reconnaissance and intelligence was poor. His staff had underestimated the extent of the minefields they had to cross in the south and failed to appreciate the effect of the Desert Air Force in the coming battle. As his 2 panzer divisions struggled in minefields, Coningham's squadrons of bombers and fighter bombers attacked them relentlessly through a night illuminated by flares. The panzers, bunched together in the narrow corridors, made comparatively easy targets. The Africa Corps and the Littorio Armored Division did not get through until the following morning, and only then did the advance north towards the Alam Halfa Ridge accelerate. Rommel was encouraged to continue, and Kesselring sent in his Stukas to batter the defensive positions ahead. But the slow and vulnerable Stukas were badly mauled by the squadrons of the Desert Air Force. The ridge was well defended, forcing the panzer divisions to a halt. Rommel expected a massive counterattack on September 1st, but Montgomery did not want to risk his armored formations in any more cavalry charges and held most of them in their positions, hull down. Only one armored counterattack was launched. Then Rommel received the worst possible news. The tankers on which he had counted had been attacked, with devastating results. Ultra had once again enabled the British to find them. Rommel was in an unenviable position, with his panzer divisions stuck in the open between the Alamein line to the west and the British armor to the east and south, and continually attacked by the Desert Air Force. On September 5th, he ordered a withdrawal. Apart from an inept counterattack by XXX Corps in the south, Montgomery failed to seize the opportunity offered to mount a devastating blow. But the repulse of the Africa Corps and the damage inflicted by the Desert Air Force did much to boost 8th Army morale. Rommel had extricated the bulk of his forces, but he knew that the tide of war in North Africa had turned irrevocably against him, even though he still had no idea of the threat to his rear being planned by Eisenhower.